Hello, and welcome back to another week. This week, our first topic is the torture of terrorist suspects, or really the ethics behind the potential use of torture in certain situations to get information. Now, it's a heavy topic. The movies themselves are quite heavy. Unthinkable is quite graphic as well. So, as usual, exercise your own discretion and caution and so on. But it's a nasty business. Now, we were looking at the question of value and reality last time. Does something have to be real to be valuable? Or can things that aren't real in the sense of not being caused by actually existing physical objects that resemble or somehow are really like our experiences, this topic here, in some sense, we're flipping the question around on its head, and instead it's a question of the value to be attached to accurate information about reality that can be used potentially to save people's lives. So let's go ahead and jump into it here. So we've got two films on this topic, so I'm going to take a little bit of time here to talk about each of them. Not in great detail. I'm going to highlight some interesting points in both of them, but I can't give a full scene-by-scene breakdown or something like that, in part because I want to make sure you've got room to think and explore and do interesting things with it. So we're going to take a look at the two films and just sort of how this topic comes up, what this topic is. And then we're going to take a look at the Dershowitz reading today. And then next video, we're going to take a look at the Ramsey reading, really arguing on the other side. So as we're going to see, Dershowitz argues in favor of the use of torture to gain information. Ramsey argues against it, categorically against it. She thinks there's never a situation where it's okay. Dershowitz thinks there are situations where it's okay, though exactly what those situations are, it's a matter of detail he doesn't fully get into, but we'll see what his argument is in favor of the legalization and use of torture, at least in certain circumstances. So the first film, Unthinkable, 2010. Now, in some ways, I think this film is, it was almost written for this debate, and in many ways it really was. So if you think back, of course, the events both of Unthinkable and Zero Dark 30 trace their way back to the events of September 11th, 2001. But of course, terrorism and the targeting of civilians in violent acts to achieve political ends is not something that started in 2001. It's much older than that. It's been around for a significant amount of time. And frankly, when we think about it in just a very large way, the use of violence against civilian populations in order to achieve political ends is something that has in some sense existed, I hate to say it this way, but since the dawn of human civilization. Anytime I say something like that, I immediately feel like I'm putting in some filler into a paper that shouldn't really be there, but humans have committed violent acts against other humans really as long as we can tell. And the fossil record we have indicates that fossils of early Homo sapiens and so on have suffered from meeting violent ends. So it's something that's there throughout our history. Now, what we're doing really in this topic and what we're trying to narrow in on is really looking at more modern forms of terrorism and what our modern condition allows for. So in particular in Unthinkable, what we get there is a real ticking bomb scenario. Now, Dershowitz's own case that we're going to look at is really talking about the ticking bomb scenario. So what is the ticking bomb scenario? So again, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the films already, I'm going to talk as if you already have. I might be giving things away, so if you want to watch the film and not have any spoilers, pause it now and go do that and then come back. So in Unthinkable, what we have is ticking bomb scenario where Michael Sheen, so the guy down on the bottom left in the poster there, so his name is younger, he changes it to Yusef, has planted 3 nuclear devices in cities in America. And then he has a list of demands, which ultimately get revealed as the film goes on. But basically what it is that they've got this guy who, might as well put this up, they know about him. He's a bomb expert. He was in Russia to look at things, and then some nuclear material disappeared, and he disappeared. Right? The circumstances are such that it seems like he could have, in fact, made nuclear devices. He claims that he has made nuclear devices, and that they're set to go off a few days from the start of the film at noon, unless his list of demands is met. So this is a real ticking bomb scenario where unless certain demands are met, or unless the bombs are found and diffused somehow or other, by getting the right kind of information about where they are and how to track them down and so on, it's very possible millions of people could die. But it could also be a hoax. And this is something that, as the film progresses, really comes to attention more. What proof do they really have that those are actual nuclear devices, right? That they don't just look like bombs. Right? It's possible that he's planted them. He claims that he's planted them, but do they really know? The only way you can really know if they were real live nuclear bombs would be if you could investigate them, if you were there, which means you had already found them. So there's this interesting issue. So this whole topic, we've been talking so far about epistemology on the one hand, the skepticism issue, how can we know things about reality, what kind of burden of proof do we have, our standards of evidence, and of course there's so much to be said on that topic, right? You do whole courses on it, and just within philosophy, and of course this is something through all sorts of different disciplines. There are all sorts of different questions about standards of evidence, when we have good reason to believe something's true and when we don't. Right? It's a huge issue. It's a huge pressing issue for us. And then there's also this question, on the other hand, of value that we've been looking at. Right? How do we value certain things? How do we weigh the value of different things? Well, in this case, we've got those merging together, right? What do we really know? Or in the case of Unthinkable, what does the government or what do the law enforcement agents really actually know versus just what do they have information to suggest to them that such and such is the case? And then what should they do in light of the information they have? So Yusef claims he's planted these bombs. He claims that they're going to go off unless his demands are met. As a matter of fact, what happens is that H, Samuel L. Jackson's character, is engaged to torture him, which he does in a very graphic way in the film. And then we've got Helen Brody, so Carrie-Anne Moss's character, as in some sense the voice of reason, the voice of sort of moral propriety, the largest opponent of the use of torture throughout the film, who of course has to grapple with that and precisely what the grounds are for it. And there's some really good scenes particularly between H and Brody, where they're talking about this and the moral status of it. Also between H and Yusef, there are a couple of pretty good scenes as well where they exchange some interesting views. So some of the relevant questions that come up, and we're going to see this in both Dershowitz's piece and in Ramsey's piece. So, one question, does torture actually work, right? And what do we mean? Well, at least in the kind of situation we're thinking about here, does it produce reliable information? If you physically torture someone or mentally, right? Because there are interesting questions about what exactly constitutes torture as well, right? We can talk about, think about things in the film, cutting off fingers, pulling out fingernails, using the dental drill without anesthesia, cutting, right? Loud music, sleep deprivation, being exposed to extreme hot or cold temperatures, waterboarding, and on and on and on and on and on. Right? And if any of that just made you cringe, good, you're probably a normal human being. If it didn't, Well, just based on what I said, all of a sudden there's an inference, well, you're not a normal human being. But there's an interesting question there as well about what constitutes normal, right? And how we regard some of these things. And that's another interesting thing that comes up in the movie as well, particularly with H's wife, which is sort of its own very, you know, subplot almost. So does torture work, right? If we put people through these sort of terrible experiences, do we get reliable information that can be used to a good end, right? The saving of lives. So in this particular case, the real question is, if we torture Yusef, can we get the information we need about where the bombs are and how many there are, which is something else that comes up in the film, to be able to save all of those innocent lives? Now, there are also questions about under what circumstances can someone be tortured, right? So something that comes up in the film is questions about legal status of subjects. So Brody brings up at one point that Yusef is an American citizen. You know, he has to be subject to habeas corpus. He can't just be detained in this way and tortured. Of course, the response is, well, he's not a citizen anymore. He was stripped of his citizenship, so it doesn't apply to him. He can be classed as an unlawful combatant. We can stick him in a different category, which removes the protections he otherwise would have had. So there's always this, you know, sort of shell game that can be played when we're thinking about the legal system, if we want to think about it very cynically, that any sort of protection that's put in there, presumably there's some sort of workaround for it, you know, even if it's just by making someone stateless or whatever it might be. There are also the questions, and I'll come back to this we're talking about 0 Dark 30, about accountability. Now, in Unthinkable, it's primarily H that's doing the torturing. He has an assistant as well. At one point, Brody even picks up a scalpel and sort of presses it into Yusef. It does cut him. I'm not trying to say, you know, oh, it wasn't too bad. She only, you know, sliced him once. But compared to the rest of his experiences, not that bad. Right? But at that point, she seems, you know, somewhat complicit in the torture. And there's this big question as it's first starting about, you know, shouldn't we stop this? What should we do? What are the orders? Where are the orders coming from? And you see a lot of people recusing themselves, sort of stepping out, right? The general in charge, once the torture really picks up, he puts colonel in command and disappears, right? Oh, you know, can't come back right now, busy, sorry. You know, name tags start getting removed. A lot of distance is being put in. By Brody staying there, is she culpable for what's going on? When she talks to her superior about it, he says, well, look, if you stay there, you can be this witness, then we can go after these people with a civil suit after, and, you know, we can get these people for doing this bad thing. In the meantime, you know, hang out in case there's any good information that we could use to save lives. This last question, can the innocent be tortured if it produces results? This is, again, spoiler alert, really the crescendo in the piece reaching the climax. You know, what's really unthinkable is that, so we've got Yusef, well, he also has a wife and children, and his wife is brought in at one point, and then H wants to start torturing her, right, in the hopes that that will be enough to get him to talk. Doesn't work out, I'll just leave it that way. And so then H wants the children, right, which he gets, sort of, but then they also stop it. So he is willing to torture the children, right, potentially cut them up, if it's going to save millions of lives. Now he's stopped. A good question there. When we're thinking about justifications, potential justifications of the use of torture to attain information for good ends, right? It's the saving of innocent lives. We can think about whether or not torture can ever be justified, and if so, under what circumstances can be justified, when used against a guilty person. So in this case, in Unthinkable, we've got really the main plotter. This is the architect of the whole thing. In fact, might be even the only person involved in the whole scheme to plant the bombs and blow them up. 0 Dark 30, we're going to see, you know, a different kind of scenario. But so here, Yusef is really, you know, the villain. He's the one doing it. He's the guilty person. He's the terrorist. We're going to see in Dershowitz him talking about people convicted of terrorism. Right? So using torture against convicted terrorists under certain circumstances. But then we can also extend this further, Zero Dark 30, for instance, using torture against terrorists. Convicted, well, if they're convicted, that implies there's been some sort of legal process, which perhaps there was not. In non-ticking bomb situations, thinking back here, we've got a ticking bomb situation in Unthinkable. If it seems like torturing the guilty terrorist, or at least the terrorist, because perhaps there's not enough time to do full legal proceedings, if that doesn't seem like it's going to work, and of course we never really know what's going to work ahead of time, so it's always a question of making decisions with limited and uncertain information, can it ever be okay to torture innocents in the hope of saving even more lives? Right? If so, under what conditions? H makes an argument that yes. Brody and others make the argument no, right? And maybe backslide a little, depending on who it is. And then, of course, there are these questions about, which I already raised a little bit, who's accountable, right? In this film, presumably H, Brody, right? President, Secretary of Defense, the general, right? Everybody involved, only some of the people involved, right? When is the law circumvented? Should the law be circumvented, right? Should torture, if it's ever okay to use, actually be part of the legal system? Or is it something that it's okay to use sometimes, but should not be part of the officially sanctioned legal system in order to make sure it's something that remains, in effect, taboo? There are, like I said, there's some pretty good scenes in this film, and the script in a lot of ways is almost written on the basis of the readings we're going to look at, or the thinking, that the readings we're going to look at have. So there's some really good exchanges. This, in some ways, is sort of the canonical case. Some good debates as well about consequentialism. Do the ends justify the means? Well, some thinkers think yes. Jeremy Bentham did. Utilitarians do. We're going to see Dershowitz specifically talk about Bentham, so there's a nice little connection here. So there's some really good dialogue in this film. And the situation is, in some sense, the perfect kind of scenario. There is a ticking bomb. You have the terrorist who claims to have done it. That's the one we want to torture. We want to torture him to get the information to defuse the bombs and save potentially millions of lives. Is that okay? Should that be sanctioned by the legal process or not? Right? So it's very interesting that way. Now, I can't even quite remember how I stumbled across this film. And I'm not quite sure about its release history either. When I've looked into it, it seems like it was something of a commercial flop. It didn't make very much money, particularly compared to its budget. It wasn't a super high budget film, as these things can go. And it looks like it had a very limited theatrical run. And it might have even just gone straight to DVD. And I'm not sure why that is, but I want to throw that out there and share it, in part because our next film, Zero Dark 30, which was 2012, so a couple of years later, was a critical success in a lot of ways. It was very popular. It also deals with this issue of torture, but in a different kind of situation. So Zero Dark 30 is not about a ticking bomb case. Really, it's ultimately about the manhunt for Osama bin Laden. Now, the film covers a lot of ground, but it's also a longer film. What we get here is this manhunt going on. And so in the wake of 9/11, what's going on? Well, American intelligence gathering efforts, CIA, in different places around the world are engaged in, frankly, a campaign of do anything to get results. And it's well documented. We're going to see Ramsey talking some about this, and she's got some interesting notes on some of what happened here. That, of course, on American soil, probably most of the time, there isn't any torture actually occurring. In the sense we're interested in here. Of course, we can talk about conditions within prisons and so on, and ask whether or not that really is a form of torture. I think those are excellent questions, but we're just going to have to shelve those for now. And the CIA is not supposed to operate on American soil, And so what you get, and particularly what you get in this film, is a lot of the CIA operating overseas, right, in different countries. So we get quite a bit in Pakistan in Zero Dark 30, other places as well. It sort of jumps around a little bit. And so really what's going on here, we're following Maya, right, the sort of main protagonist, as she is doggedly pursuing UBL, Osama bin Laden. And she, right at the start of the film, sort of like fresh off the plane, meets Dan, and is basically immediately exposed to torture and torture practices. Now, what's going on there is not really a ticking bomb scenario. So what we're introduced to at the start of the film is really Dan torturing Amar, and then Maya coming in and being sort of, if you sort of pay attention to the delivery there, Maya looks pretty uncomfortable with what's happening near the start. But she sort of quickly adapts to what's going on, starts being complicit, gets some water to help with the waterboarding, though she doesn't necessarily know that's exactly what's going to happen. But Dan asks her when Amar is being held down with something, covering his face, to get some water. What is it for? Oh, I'm thirsty and I want to drink? Probably not. So there are questions here again about complicity and what is it to actually be involved in the torture and so on. But we don't have a ticking bomb scenario in the same way we do in Unthinkable, right? It's not like Amar claims he's planted nuclear devices, or there are nuclear devices out there or something, or a dirty bomb or whatever, and they think Amar is the only one with the information. No, right? It's not that at all. We get through some exchanges between Dan and Amar evidence that Amar has supported terrorism, right? He was a money man. To the best of my recollection, we are never told that Amar has actually himself killed anybody. I'm not saying he didn't. I'm just off the top of my head, I don't recall us ever getting evidence of that. But Amar's name is on a bank transfer for a few $1,000s. Some explosives were found in his residence when he was captured and so on. So he is a supporter of terrorism. He is, by some definition, a terrorist. Of course, there's a very good question here, going back to what I was saying before. What actually counts as terrorism? Oh, that's another big one. That might be something worth stipulating, if necessary, if you want to write on this topic in an essay. But getting into the full nature and producing arguments about what does and doesn't count as terrorism, that's probably beyond our scope here, although it's a very worthwhile subject. So what we have here is really a campaign of torture being used by the American operatives, CIA, and their allies, in scenarios that are not obviously ticking bomb scenarios. Though there are attacks, right? There are attacks that occur. They do get some evidence as they're torturing Amar. He does sort of slip and reveal that something is supposed to happen, and he gives a day, but then he sort of covers it up by just saying all the different days, and then an attack does in fact happen. So there are some interesting questions there. What does Amar really know? Is there a ticking bomb scenario or not, right? The ticking bomb scenario could be something larger as well. It could be about, it need not just be about a ticking bomb, but some kind of, time-limited event that's going to occur. We know this bad thing is going to happen. This person probably has information that can be used to help prevent it. So are we justified or not in torturing? So here again, we have questions about the reliability of information. That one really rears its head in Zero Dark 30 because there's, throughout the film, there's information being gathered via torture. And then as the film progresses, there are questions about what information can be trusted and what can't. This crops up in a few different places, particularly later in the film before the strike against the house that is thought to contain UBL is sanctioned. We have this discussion right at the end, or not right at the end, but before that actually occurs. How confident are we in this information? Because we don't have a visual on Osama bin Laden. Nobody's seen him. We haven't been in the house, right? Are we going to order this Delta Force strike in Pakistan or not? Right? How confident are we? Maya is 100% or 99 or 95. She sort of tones it down, but she's totally confident, right? Other people, including Dan, less, right? Dan himself, I think he gives it something like 60%. He says, you know, I've been in a lot of those rooms, right? You can't trust what's being said all the time. Now, Maya believes that she's got a lot more information that corroborates across all sorts of different people, but that only works because there's this overarching campaign of torture being used to gather information. Right? So there's questions about the reliability of the information you get from torturing somebody, right? What counts as being involved in torture? So like I just said, is Maya getting the bucket of water, does that count? Does only using the information gathered by torture, but not actively participating in the torture yourself, does that count, right? What if we just farm it out, right? What if Canada, you know, no Canadian agent ever was involved in torturing a terrorist suspect, but countries allied with us did in fact torture them and then passed along the information they got from the torture, right? Would that make us complicit in torture? Does that make us involved in it somehow? What sorts of moral distance can we put up, right, between us and the actions and the results that they get us? What about the accountability of those who torture? This is something that comes up. Later in the film, Dan sort of warns Maya, you know, the politics are changing and you don't want to be the last person caught holding a dog collar. Right? Don't get yourself burned. So you need to be careful with what you're doing, right? There are political considerations. Again, the legal status of torture, right? Where is it happening? What citizen is it? What kind of country? What sorts of laws are being invoked and so on? Who should be tortured, right? Should a Mar be tortured? Should anybody we think might have some information that could potentially be useful in stopping an attack that we don't even know about be tortured? Why not just torture everybody? Who knows what they know, right? Now, as a matter of fact, the information gathered here actually does lead to Osama bin Laden. And of course, this film is based on real events and eyewitness accounts and so on. You get that right at the start. Unlike Unthinkable, which is really it's a work of fiction, though a work of fiction that's, you know, could potentially mimic real life. And in fact, there could have been a scenario like that that we don't even know about. It's possible. Also, there's an alternative ending, if depending on the version of Unthinkable you see. There's an extended version. So in the original version, it stops with Agent Brody out sort of on the front steps with Yusuf's children. In the extended version, there's another minute or so of content there where they go find the last bomb, the third bomb, deactivate it, and then it sort of cuts over. And in fact, hidden behind a wall is the fourth bomb that H was talking about, which, well, we don't see sort of what happens, but we see it count down to 0. And so presumably at the end of Unthinkable, depending on the ending you want to go with, because, you know, we're not really told what happens, if you go with that extended ending, then, you know, despite all the torture, because they stopped short, or maybe not, right, even if H got to do what he wanted with the children, we don't know ahead of time what Yusuf would have done. A bomb still goes off and kills potentially millions of people. Right? So the information that's derived via torture in Zero Dark 30, okay, in real life, leads to you know, the location of Osama bin Laden and ultimately his assassination, call it whatever you want, right? Though with that scene before the strike started, like I said, they can't really confirm whether or not that really is Osama's location, especially not through normal legal channels. So this comes up in one meeting, that, you know, if they tried to ask one of the terrorists or something, they could just tell their lawyer to go warn Osama through, you know, some kind of contact network. So it's only with some kind of detainee program, potentially a torture program, one that denies the terrorists of, you know, basic legal rights, such as the ability to consult with an attorney and so on, that they can try to check up on that information. And so look, I pose a question at the end here, right? We have in Zero Dark 30, not really a ticking bomb scenario, though there are arguably some cases where the attacks happen where there is a ticking bomb scenario. But through the widespread use of torture as a means to gather information, the location of Osama bin Laden is eventually discovered, and then they go and kill him, right? Is that outcome a sufficient justification for the widespread use of torture? Getting enough information to say, strike a high-value target, right? Does that count? What kinds of trade-offs are we willing to entertain? this is really part of what we're talking about here, and I try to give it a little bit more focus with the essay questions. But with that now behind us, let's go ahead and take a look at the Dershowitz piece. So Alan Dershowitz, professor emeritus at Harvard Law School. He's been there for over 50 years. He was, at least at the time, I think he was first there when he's something like the age of 25, and he was, I believe, the youngest person that Harvard, or at least Harvard Law School, has ever given tenure to, I believe, before he's even 30. Now, he's a very well-known public figure. You've probably heard of him just recently. He helped defend President Trump in the impeachment trial just this year. He's was also, I believe, involved in the defense of Jeffrey Epstein, O.J. Simpson as well. He's written widely on U.S. politics, law, Israel, many, many different topics. He's published over 30 books, and at least according to his blurb on his Harvard website, over 1,000 articles. So he's a very well-known public intellectual figure in America, perhaps, admired, perhaps loathed. I think this is a very good instance to sort of remind ourselves to keep our focus on the arguments and not the people. So whether or not you like Dershowitz, you like what you take to be his politics, right? Well, he helped defend President Trump, so he must be, Trump conservative or something. Maybe, maybe not. Right? People are also committed to other things. They also have ideas and ideals about rule of law and how politics and legal systems ought to operate, right? Is he just sort of a, opportunist willing to make a buck wherever? Is he just somebody that likes the limelight? Or is he really a principled defender of what he takes to be the ideals of American society? Just not an issue we're going to get into here. And so whether you just don't know anything about him, love him or hate him, okay, keep the focus on the arguments. Right? And so spending time, think about forum poster or the essay, right? Going on about how he's defended O.J. Simpson or Trump or whatever, which makes him terrible or great or whatever. It's just irrelevant to the argument he made here, right? The same argument could have been made by anybody, right? And it's not who makes the argument that makes it a good argument. If it did, that would lead us quickly down the road of things like, racism and sexism. Oh, the argument was made by, right? Pick whatever the category is, right? Oh, a woman? Oh, well, then the argument couldn't have been any good because, well, what do you fill in there, right? Just stupidity and misogyny. Right? It's not who makes the argument. It's really the quality of the argument that matters. So that's what we should focus on. And that is part of the huge problem with things like sexism and racism, that they really impede good thinking, right? Because they start focusing on the generally irrelevant aspects, right? Who made it, instead of, are the reasons good? Do they really support the conclusion? Side note, there can be, relevance with who's saying what, especially when it speaks to certain sorts of motivations and so on. So I'm not trying to completely discount that and promote some sort of completely blind sort of, classic liberalism or something. What I am trying to get at is that we should try to take arguments on their own merits and not just automatically agree or disagree or whatnot based on our predisposition for the person or any sort of group that they belong to. Okay. Oh, I clicked a thing I didn't mean to click. Hopefully that didn't screw you up too much. All right, so what are we going to see in the case for torturing the ticking bomb terrorist, which is part of a larger work, a book of his, why terrorism works. So, broken it down to 3 pieces. First, the case for torturing the ticking bomb terrorist. Second, the conflict in values that a liberal democracy faces when considering the use of torture, at least under certain circumstances. And third, he argues that torture should be an explicit part of the American legal system with a warrant requirement. Now, he is focused particularly on the American case, and in fact, what I've been talking about, the films themselves are also, the films are also focused on, the American case, the American point of view, which in some ways makes sense. So we can think about this, again, in multiple ways. We can think about it in terms of, should this be Should torture be used by Americans to gather information to protect Americans, Canadians to protect Canadians, right? We can think about it quite largely. So we can think about it more abstractly. Should a liberal democracy, right, like Canada or the United States or anything else, right, any other country that fits the appellation. So also, liberal democracy, what does that mean really? A democracy that values and defends individuals' rights and freedoms. Should liberal democracies ever utilize torture in an effort to gain information for the purpose of saving innocent lives? Right? There is a good way to think about it a little bit more abstractly. So we can be more or less specific in how we want to think about it. So first, the case of torture. The way that Dershowitz explains it, it really comes down to a simple choice of evils question, right? What's worse, to subject one guilty person to non-lethal torture, or to let more than one innocent person die in a terrorist attack? Dershowitz tells us, obviously the latter is the worst person, right? Making one guilty person, suffer non-lethal torture, making them feel extreme pain and discomfort, right? Extreme, right? It's just not as bad as having someone die. This is really Dershowitz's point. A death is worse than non-lethal torture, right? And even the kind of torture that he advocates is really the kind of torture that probably, if done by capable hands, won't even leave lasting sort of damage or mutilation to the person. Dershowitz isn't here advocating, chopping off fingers or some of the things H is doing to Youssef, right? So, perhaps waterboarding, perhaps some different things like that. Bad things, right? And Dershowitz is saying, these things are just fine, and it's, well, no problem at all. But he's not claiming that. But he's saying, look, we need to sort of step back and really think about this. What's worse, having an innocent person die or having a guilty person be exposed to extreme pain, right? Pain and suffering. Death is worse, right? The death of the innocent person. And if we start thinking about this on a larger scale, something like Unthinkable, right? And this is where the modern context is relevant again. Given that we live in an age where there are nuclear bombs and chemical attacks are possible, biological attacks, just even attacks with machine guns and things like this. An awful lot of damage can be done by one or a small number of individuals. Or if we went back to like the Middle Ages, people would still be terrible, right? Horrible, horrible people. But if what you have are like swords and axes and stuff, you just don't have that same capability, right? A nuclear weapon really changes how things work and how much danger an individual or a small group of people can pose. So this is where Dershowitz really talks about Bentham, Bentham's greatest happiness principle, and he really talks about Bentham's own justification for this, the use of torture, that there are situations under which the utility calculus, trying to figure out what really produces the greater overall happiness, well, it's going to favor the use of torture, at least sometimes, right? Make Youssef suffer extreme pain and suffering for a few days and save millions of lives, right? If we're thinking in terms of overall happiness, the calculation is just so obvious, right? Now, Dershowitz does take a little bit of time to distinguish between case or act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. I haven't stuck that on the slides, but basically the distinction is this. When somebody is an act utilitarian, they are trying to apply the greatest happiness principle or the principle of utility directly to particular acts or situations. So, should we torture Youssef, right, younger, in the situation in Unthinkable, right? That's one way to think about it. The rule utilitarian, instead of trying to analyze the actual case or acts choices at hand, instead thinks in terms of what overall rules would be best for society. So really it's a question of, should liberal democracies use torture as a means of gathering information to save innocent lives in a ticking bomb scenario or what have you, right? So there's that discussion there. In some sense, really what Dershowitz is doing here is precisely doing a rule utilitarian approach, because he's trying to think about it in terms of law. You know, what should we allow? What kind of general procedure or general approach is really the best one? So Dershowitz thinks, you know, it's obviously better to save more than one innocent person's life by the use of non-lethal torture against one, potentially even more, guilty suspects. So as he says, it is surely better to inflict non-lethal pain on one guilty terrorist who is illegally withholding information needed to prevent an act of terrorism than to permit a large number of innocent victims to die. Pain is a lesser and more remediable harm than death, and the lives of 1,000 innocent people should be valued more than the bodily integrity of one guilty person. Dershowitz also notes that many legal policies, are based on a choice of evils such as this one. So, for instance, the use of deadly force, right? Deadly force can be used on suspects of dangerous felonies. Military actions often produce civilian casualties. Right? In both cases, really what's going on is that people not committed of a crime are lawfully killed, right? Why? Because of the choice of evils. You know, if somebody is suspected of a felony, if somebody, right, police officers suspect somebody just committed a murder or something, and they turn and run away. Exactly what Dershowitz is talking about here is that it depends on the legal system in question, depends on the jurisdiction. So there can be differences here between, say, Canada and the United States. There can be differences between different levels of law enforcement as well. Is it, provincial, territorial, federal, right? Is it states or federal government, et cetera, et cetera. So jurisdiction does matter. But the idea here is that, the use of deadly force is used on people suspected of committing dangerous felonies or suspected of being a threat to other people, right? They don't have to be tried and convicted before the use of force against them is authorized. Military actions, right, are undertaken that produce civilian casualties, right? They kill people who aren't even being accused of doing anything wrong. But those actions are still taken because it's thought that there's a greater good brought about by doing that, precisely because of the value in, say, striking the people who actually are dangerous and so on. You might even be using those civilians as a shield, right? Or just so happen to be near them. So, just on this note, with the choice of evils here, Dershowitz explicitly exempts people who who oppose inflicting harm on others under any circumstances. So he identifies Quakers. The Quaker religious social movement is this. If you don't know who they are, just look up Quakers on the internet. Really, the one element of Quakers, the one that he's really talking about, is precisely that they are not willing to engage in violent activity at all. So, self-defense, even there, they say, nope, you're not allowed, you're not justified in using violence as a tool of self-defense. You are never justified in doing it. He says, if that is the line you're willing to take, that there are never situations under which you would be justified in doing something that would normally be wrong, such as using violence against somebody. He says, okay, great. Then you're exempt from my reasoning, right? Then, because Dershowitz precisely arguing that this is a choice of evils question. So he says, if you're never willing to make a choice of evils, you say, you're never justified in doing something that would be normally wrong, even if it seems to bring about a larger good in the end. He sort of shrugs and says, okay, well, at least you're consistent, right? And if you're consistent, then maybe, the argument's not going to be convincing to you. But that's really not most people, right? That's a very minority view, Dershowitz is claiming. And he's probably right? If people like Quakers were in the majority, you probably wouldn't see countries where that's the case. They wouldn't have armies, right? They might not, their policing tactics would likely be quite different and so on. Okay, so this is really the basic case, right? It's worse to not use torture in at least the ticking bomb scenario than it is to use torture, right? It's the lesser of two evils, which is what justifies us in doing it. So there are two immediate objections that Dershowitz considers and responds to. So here again, great example in terms of thinking about objections and responding to them. First, torture doesn't provide reliable results, right, which brought up in both films. And this has been a serious question about the use of torture for a long time. Dershowitz responds that no law enforcement tactic always works, and torture works at least sometimes. Now, a little bit before the reading I actually gave you, Dershowitz recounts a case reported in the Washington Post. In 1995, are his words, Philippine authorities tortured a terrorist into disclosing information that may have foiled plots to assassinate the Pope and to crash 11 commercial airliners carrying approximately 4,000 passengers into the Pacific Ocean. The torture in that case lasted 67 days. So 67 days of torture. It sounds like it was a single suspect that was tortured for 67 days, eventually produced information that may have helped save the life of 4,000 people. Now, of course, when we're dealing with counterfactuals, what would have happened if they didn't have that information? Would those 4,000 people have died? Maybe, maybe not, right? Maybe if they were hijackers or something, maybe they got in a car accident on the way to the airport and died, or who knows, right? We don't really know what the future holds. We don't fully know what would have happened if things had been different this way or that way. That's part of our unfortunate situation as humans, right? We've got a limited amount of information, and based on that limited amount of information, we have to make inferences about what's likely to happen or not happen. And our inferences aren't certain. I'll go out on a limb and say, never really be certain about whether or not we've got all the information, whether or not all the information is accurate, whether or not we're missing something, whether or not we're judging it appropriately. So Dershowitz points to examples like this one to say that even if torture doesn't produce reliable results, right, it at least produces results of some sort, right? And in some cases, such as the ticking bomb case, torture might be the only available means of extracting the information required to stop a massive attack, right? In Unthinkable, Youssef is very committed to having those bombs go off if his demands aren't met, right? He is committed. In fact, he turns himself in, right? He's sort of steeled himself to be tortured to know what's coming. And he takes it, right? He goes through that whole thing. So he is fully committed to what he's doing, right? And so trying to reason with him or talk him out of it or anything like that, highly unlikely to work. Again, it might, maybe, right? But how likely is it to work? It seems highly unlikely, right? Is torture going to work, right? Dershowitz, maybe, right? It's better than nothing. Even if it doesn't produce reliable results, it's going to work at least sometimes, presumably, right? And if we think about, say the Zero Dark 30 case, there, again, does it produce reliable results? Maybe not, particularly used, just by itself, but used in conjunction with other means, right? Bribery, using torture amongst multiple people, and then cross-checking testimony and so on, right? Trying to use good judgment with the evidence that's being produced, right? The information that's coming out, you don't just 100% trust it. Instead, that's one more data point or one more set of data points to be incorporated into our body of evidence that we then use to make considered judgments about what's most likely true or false. So torture doesn't provide reliable results. That's the objection. Dershowitz, yes, right? I admit that point, but that's not our standard, right? We don't always need reliable results. Well, we don't need universally reliable results. And depending on the situation we're interested in, Dershowitz is particularly interested in the ticking bomb case. That's really what he's talking about here. He's only talking about using torture in the ticking bomb case. Torture works at least sometimes, and if we're in a ticking bomb case, we need to use anything we can to get results. Second objection, condoning torture under any circumstances leads to a slippery slope. Dershowitz, in response to this, argues for a principled break, right? So the slippery slope is basically this problem that gets posed. And so if you've done critical thinking or Logic 1000 or something like that, you've maybe heard of this or heard of it somewhere else. The basic idea is that think of it as an actual slippery slope, right? If you've ever had to go down a slippery slope, if you take the first step and the slope is that slippery, will you be able to stop yourself? Or are you going to find yourself, tumbled down at the bottom of the hill? The slippery slope is a kind of concern, right? Well, if we do this first step, are we going to be able to stop ourselves, right? Slippery slope argument or concern was invoked with the legalization of cannabis in Canada, right? Cannabis in Canada, say that 10 times fast. Well, look, if we legalize this, what's next? Are we gonna, legalize heroin and have everybody using heroin or something, right? If we legalize it, is that gonna lead to, explosive widespread use? Is everybody gonna be driving high? Are kids gonna be doing it all the time, et cetera, right? Where do we stop, right? Which is then that kind of threat or problem is raised as a reason not to take the first step down the slope. So in response to this, Dershowitz argues for this principled break. He says, okay, right, there, slippery slope can be a problem, like where do we stop? He says, okay, let's pick a spot, right? We'll work into the argument, into what we're talking about, sort of the explicit conditions about when we should and shouldn't use it. So the conditions that he opts for are that torture should only be used on convicted terrorists as a last resort to garner information from. So a torture warrant must be provided by a judge. So not only do law enforcement officials have to be, engaged in trying to gather information, they need to be at a spot where they have, no sort of other fruitful leads, right? It doesn't seem like they can get the information any other way. They have sufficient reason, right? Sufficient evidence to believe that this suspect or, this guilty terrorist has the information or has at least some information that could be used and could be useful in stopping the ticking bomb situation. And the terrorist should be incentivized to talk before torture is even used. So they should be given immunity from prosecution, so nothing they say could be used against them. They should be offered protection. They should even be offered, maybe like cash rewards, right? Torture should be used as a last means. So it's only used against guilty terrorists who are unwilling to provide information that they're legally obligated to provide, right? They should be incentivized with positive rewards to encourage them to do it. And only if they fail to do that, only if there's good enough reason to believe that they actually have the information, have information that would be useful, then the case should be brought before a judge. It shouldn't be up to the field agents to make that decision. Instead, it should work through the legal system, and a judge should review the evidence and grant, or not, a warrant. Right? Now, while allowing for any infringements of someone's rights may lead to a slippery slope, adding principled breaks and protections helps stop the slip, right? And Dershowitz knows this is simply how laws operate all the time, right? Police may search someone's property if they obtain a judicial warrant or have just cause, but they can't go around just searching willy-nilly, right? And this is something that's shared between really liberal democracies in general. There are checks and balances on what the police can do, right? They can't just go down the street and go door to door, just searching, just see what they find, right? And then, oh, hey, well, we found something illegal in this house, so now we're justified retroactively in having searched here in the first place. Now, of course, as a matter of fact, things like that do happen, at least sometimes. There are large questions about how often things like that happen, improprieties being conducted within various justice systems and so on. And so I'm not trying to sweep that under the rug here. And in fact, Dershowitz in some ways draws attention to that in this piece, talking about, what goes on in prisons, for instance. And he says, a lot of people who don't like torture, right, would object to the use of torture, sort of remain blissfully unaware of the terrible things that happen in prisons, right? Out of sight, out of mind, and they just sort of don't want to know. And Dershowitz himself, maybe he's sort of double dipping here. He sort of points to what goes on in prisons as highly problematic, but then also points to it as this kind of evil we tolerate in some sense, and in fact trying to intimidate uncooperative witnesses and so on by threatening to stick them in prison until they become more cooperative is a tactic he notes is often used, though not one he himself condones. Okay, so this is really the case for torturing, right? It's a lesser of two evils. It should only be done under certain conditions, right? Sure, it doesn't provide universally reliable results, but that's not exactly what we're going for here. So now that the case is on the table, he's already dealt with a couple of objections. Dershowitz helps outline the conflict in values that really makes this a problem for us. And he notes it really is only a problem for a liberal democracy somewhere like Canada or the United States that takes the rights of individuals seriously. So there are these three values, these three fundamental values. First, protecting the safety and security of a nation's citizens. Right? It seems pretty uncontroversial that that's a value, right? Particularly in a liberal democracy, a free society. Right? Second, the preservation of civil liberties and human rights. Again, something that a liberal democracy is concerned with because it's concerned with the liberties and rights of individuals. It's not just whatever the majority says goes. Open accountability and visibility in a democracy. Okay, this is the third component. Democracy should not be run as shadowy governments where information isn't revealed to the population. Right? Really, in a democracy, it's the power of the people. That's literally what it is. The demos, right? The populace, the community. It has so that's democracy comes from a couple of Greek words. The crassy part really comes from Greek words meaning power. The demo part comes from a Greek word meaning people, right? The sort of the people. So it's really the power of the people. So Dershowitz has offered a consequentialist case, so really a kind of utilitarian case in favor of legally institutionalized torture. And he thinks this sacrifices to the preservation of civil liberties and human rights to an extent to best protect 1 and 3. Now, as Dershowitz himself says, going back to just what I was saying there about prisons, some people just don't even like to acknowledge there is a conflict. Right? They like to pretend that there's, we live in sort of the best of all possible worlds where these things never really come into conflict. And in fact, torturing people would just jeopardize the safety and security of the nation's citizens, as well as erode the preservation of civil liberties and so on. So instead, Dershowitz argues that really the best balance of these three we can get when they do come into conflict, which they will come into conflict, especially in a ticking bomb situation, right? And so I think this is where Unthinkable is a very fruitful film for this, in really helping to highlight this, right? Where that comes into tension. Zero Dark 30, things are a little bit murkier there, which I think is also a very useful kind of scenario to think about. Just thinking about what goes on in Zero Dark 30 overall, with Osama bin Laden still being out there, to what extent does that jeopardize the safety and security of, say, the United States citizens or the citizens of liberal democracies and sort of Western countries? It's a good question. Right? It is a good question. So, so we've got this conflict of values, right? At some point, if you need information and people aren't willing to give it to you, right, having that information would help protect the safety and security of citizens, right? If people aren't willing to give it to you, right, say convicted terrorists or something, well, of course, there's human rights and civil liberties. So there are those questions about to what extent should those be overridden, if ever, right? And of course, we could just sort of cross our arms and say, well, Youssef in Unthinkable, he knows where the bombs are. But hey, it would be wrong to torture him. So we better just, just sit here and just kind of wait for the bombs to go off. And then the open accountability and visibility in democracy, this is really a question about whether or not, if torture is going to be used, is it going to be done in secret? Right? Or is it going to be something that is subject to public discussion, subject to public scrutiny, something that can be reviewed and talked about afterward? Something we can help develop policies that, the people have say over. So this is really the tension in values. And Dershowitz wants to, in light of those, take a look at really the 4 options for what to do with torture. So he considers the 4, so we'll go through each of the 4 and what he thinks about them. So first, in ticking bomb scenarios, right, and that's really all Dershowitz is talking about. And if you're dealing with an essay question, you're trying to deal with a topic that goes beyond that, you have to think about how his argument could be extended to non-ticking bomb scenarios. And that's where I think Zero Dark 30 becomes very useful. So in a ticking bomb scenario, we've got a guilty terrorist who's not willing to cooperate under any other circumstances. Do we opt for torture or not? Right? well, we could completely forego it and just let the attacks occur. Just, shrug our shoulders and just say no. This approach prizes civil liberties and human rights is really inviolable, right? You can't ever trade them off for anything, right? This is the, in some sense, the Quakers' approach, right? We're not engaged in those sorts of trade-offs. We aren't doing the lesser of two evils, right? We just say there are certain things we just don't ever do. Agent Brody, right, in Unthinkable. Great example of this. She gives voice to this view in a few places in the film, which really well done. Again, I think it's a great script. Well delivered, in my view as well, but what do I know, right? Dershowitz thinks in practice, almost nobody's going to make this choice, right? And especially as the detonation in Unthinkable is getting closer and closer, we see everybody, even Brody, really sort of, being swung towards the, okay, we need to do whatever it takes to stop this thing, right? Well, we still had a day or 2 days or 3 days to, work on other ways of trying to find those devices and deactivate them. As we're getting down to the wire, right, it becomes increasingly pressing to do whatever it takes to preserve potentially millions of lives, right? Dershowitz thinks really nobody is actually going to make this choice in practice, right? Again, some might, right? The committed Quaker, the person who is not willing to make the trade-off, they aren't willing to, choose the lesser of two evils, right? That just, right? That they'd rather terrible things occur than that they'd have to do something that would normally seem wrong. So, and again, right? If the approach is to not engage in that kind of consequentialist thinking at all, right? Not to do the trade-offs. In some sense, Dershowitz, right? He's willing to allow, okay, look, if you disagree that deeply, then, perhaps there are, the differences in view are so deep that the argument he's making just isn't going to be convincing at all. But Dershowitz thinks most people are actually consequentialists to some degree, right? At some point, people are willing to choose the lesser of two evils. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to say all, but much public policy, much legal policy and so on is based on a lesser of two evils sort of approach. So second, outlaw torture and prosecute anyone who engages in it. Now, Dershowitz thinks it's kind of odd to categorically, that is, without exception, outlaw a tactic that could, or at least could, produce results and prevent a massive evil from occurring, right? He also notes that if torture was outlawed and then law enforcement officials did engage in torture and then actually stopped an attack, right, they almost certainly would not be prosecuted, right? Just, just think about the public outcry if somebody who saved millions of lives was then incarcerated because of what they did, right? And those lives were only saved because of what was done, right? The torture that occurred. So the second view to Dershowitz seems very odd, right? To make a tactic that could save potentially lots and lots of lives, to make it completely illegal in a way that seems utterly unenforceable, right? To him, it just seems counterproductive, right? It doesn't seem like the right way to go. Third, use non-institutionalized torture. What does that mean? Really allow torture to be used outside of the regular legal framework. Now, this sacrifices open accountability, right? That third value. Open accountability in a democracy. It also sacrifices civil liberties and human rights. So what's going on is that torture is occurring, but it's not institutionalized in a way. It's not part of the explicit legal framework, such that we can have discussions about how it should be handled, what sorts of limits there should be on it, under what circumstances it should and shouldn't be used, what the evidentiary requirements are, what sorts of tactics should and should not be allowed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Dershowitz thinks going this route actually sacrifices two of the sets of values we want to protect. It protects safety and security, but it does so by really undermining and eroding some of the hallmark features of a liberal democracy. Now, doing it this way is also going to make its use inconsistent, right? So it might be used in one instance where in another very similar instance it isn't used. There might be inconsistency, which is always a problem within the legal system, right? That should be ideally consistent. There's also no guarantee that the methods being employed are going to be effective. So, you know, just for instance, in Unthinkable, we have H who, you know, we're basically told he's a professional torturer, right? That seems to really be his job. If we look at, you know, Zero Dark 30 and we look at Dan, right, and perhaps Maya, I think that's a little bit more ambiguous. You know, Dan seems like a professional torturer. He tells us at one point that he's, you know, been involved, you know, something like he's seen over 100 naked men or something like that. So presumably been involved in the torture of like 100 different people. Right? Now, of course, that seems pretty terrible, right? But that also means the people engaged in the torturing have experience of what they're doing. If the aim is to use non-lethal techniques to, you know, maximize pain and suffering, but minimize maiming and long-term effects, right? You know, if what we're trying to do is really put the person in such a terrible situation that they're willing to provide the information to then save lives, presumably we want people who know how best to do that, right? Not just whoever happens to be there, right? You know, whatever agent happens to be on the ground and sort of thrust into the situation. All of a sudden, they now have to make these decisions about whether or not they're going to torture and what they're going to do, right? You know, look, honest question. How long can you waterboard somebody before they drown? I don't know, right? If I was suddenly put in a situation and I decided to torture and decide to use something like waterboarding, I don't really know what I'm doing, right? I don't know what the most effective techniques are for maximizing pain, minimizing long-term damage, and making sure that the person being tortured survives. I don't know. So the risks of accidents, as well as the risks of, you know, long-term damage or not using tactics that are actually going to work increase by opting for this non-institutionalized torture. So fourth, right, institutionalized torture, integrating it into the regular American legal framework. Here again, we can extend this, right? Dershowitz is talking specifically about the American case, but we can extend this further, apply it to liberal democracies more generally, right? Should Canada, should Britain, should America, should France, should Germany, should, right, keep, you know, any country you're willing to classify as a liberal democracy, go ahead and stick it in here. Should torture be part of their legal framework? Dershowitz argues yes, right? This is the alternative he favors. Why? Well, and you know, specifically, again, going back to what I was saying before, torture should be part of the legal system. There should be, right, it should only be sanctioned under certain conditions, right? There should be certain evidentiary requirements. There should be certain legal requirements about under what circumstances it is allowed. There should be a warrant requirement. Right, it's not just agents in the field deciding they want to do whatever they do, which, you know, we see this sort of in Unthinkable and Zero Dark 30. And normally when law enforcement wants to do something to someone, often, not always, but often they have to go before a judge and get a warrant. Right? You want to tap a phone or go, you know, rummage through somebody's property or whatever. Often law enforcement has to go before a judge and say, okay, here's the evidence we have, here's what we want to do, and the judge looks at it and is supposed to sort of, you know, think about the standards that are set for when are we allowed to do this kind of thing? Does the evidence meet that standard or not, right? That's really what Dershowitz is advocating. There are only certain situations where torture can be allowed, right, and they should be, right, we should have really a principled break there to prevent the slippery slope. We don't want it just happening all over the place, right? That certainly wouldn't be any good. That would erode the preservation of civil liberties and human rights. Would probably also sacrifice that open accountability and visibility in a democracy. Right? So he's not advocating, you know, to have it all over the place, but to have it in certain instances, in those ticking bomb scenarios, right, done through a judge, so on and so forth. Now, he thinks this approach really best balances those three competing sets of values. Right? We sacrifice civil liberties and human rights to a certain degree in certain situations, but it promotes accountability and transparency, right? Because we can review what went on, court records will be, right? Should be public record, at least at some point. People can look back through them and see if things were done properly or not. People can be disciplined for not following the rules, right? Even if they get good results, that still doesn't justify, not following the legal process and so on, if there's one in place. And of course, we can look at what that process is and say it's not very good, it needs to be reformed and changed. Great, that's Dershowitz is, all on board for that. So Dershowitz thinks that the use of torture warrants is really going to reduce the use of torture to the smallest amount and degree possible, while creating public accountability for its real use. That's how he puts it. So, institutionalizing torture, Dershowitz argues, is actually going to minimize how often it's used. Right? This is actually going to reduce how often it's used, because it's only going to be used in situations where sort of agents in the field already think it should be used, because only in those situations will they bring it before a judge, right? And judges presumably are not going to grant torture warrants 100% of the time. So because there's a double check there, there's a two-level system, Dershowitz thinks that's going to reduce the overall amount of torture being used. Using it in an institutionalized way like this is also going to help actually encourage results from it, right? By making it part of the explicit legal system, then suspects are going to realize that it's a very real possibility that if there's a discussion of them being tortured, it's not that the agents or individuals who are thinking about torturing them are putting themselves on the line, so to speak, by doing something illegal or doing something that they're not supposed to do. Instead, by knowing that's just part of the usual legal process that might be used against them, threats that you might be tortured if you don't give us this information are going to hold a lot more weight. So this really takes us to the end of Dershowitz's case for institutionalizing the use of torture. So I think that's probably enough for this video. Dershowitz himself gives us a pretty interesting case. There are the two films where we get two different versions, sort of two different sets of events where this topic comes up. In the next video, we're going to take a look at Maureen Ramsey's piece, where she argues against the use of torture, really under any circumstances. And we're going to see why it is that she thinks that's the case, why she argues that we should believe that's the case. And we're going to see that she even criticizes the way Dershowitz frames the issue. She thinks that in some sense, he's not accurately describing what choices we're really looking at and what the sorts of choices Dershowitz encourages are really going to result in. That's it for now. See you next time. Well, okay, you'll see me next time. I hope you're doing well, and see you another day.